Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 500,000 times in over 145 countries and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
In today's episode 189, we talk to children's book author Inga Simpson on her latest book, The Book of Australian Trees. Trees tell stories about places, and Australia has some of the tallest, the oldest, the fattest, and the most unusual trees in the world. The Book of Australian Trees, while aimed at children, is also something that adults will appreciate. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Okay, Inga, thank you for taking your time to talk with Australian Hiker.
Oh, hi, Tim. Good to talk to you.
All right, now before we talk about your latest book, give us a brief introduction to yourself.
Yeah, I grew up on a property in Central West New South Wales and had a whole kind of career in government before as a professional writer and researcher before switching to creative writing in my mid-30s. And I've ended up on the far south coast of New South Wales, and the creative writing gig worked out okay. This is my 5th book, but my first book for children. Yeah.
So would you consider yourself an outdoorsy person or a hiker at all?
Absolutely. I'm considered a nature writer because I focus so much on the natural world. And in a way, it's strange that I've chosen writing as a career because I would much rather be outside, moving over the landscape. And I'm a pretty keen photographer too, so always looking for a new place to explore and take pictures. And at the end of May, I just got back from the Larapinta Trail. I did the whole end-to-end with Trek Larapinta, which was got to be one of the highlights of my life, actually. It was fantastic.
No, it's definitely a good trail and definitely has given you some ideas for another book.
Yes, but I don't know what form. I mean, definitely another book about Australian trees. I think it'd be lovely to do one on desert trees. They're just such remarkable, adaptive, tough trees and so specific to their landscape. So, this book focuses on 15 of the more sort of charismatic trees across the countryside. But I think it'd be nice to look at the specific trees within a particular landscape and how those ecosystems work and interact. The desert oak, really captured my imagination, actually. Spends the first half of its life kind of looking like a bit of a gonk tree. And, all its energy is going underground, getting down to water. Before then it starts transforming into quite a graceful, magnificent tree. And the breeze through a desert oak across the desert is, really something.
All right, so that then brings us on to the topic for today, and this is your latest book, which is The Book of Australian Trees. Why this book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on one hand, trees, that's kind of what I do, but writing for children was a big shift. My last book or previous book was called Understory, A Life with Trees, and that was my first work of nonfiction, nature writing, I guess you'd call it, or a nature writing memoir. About 10 years I spent living in a cottage inside a forest in southeast Queensland, and in all the ways that changed my life. And the book is structured like a forest. It has called Understory. It has an understory, middle story, and canopy or overstory. And each chapter was a species of tree, focused on a species of tree and sort of unpacked, stories around that tree. And a lot of people had said, oh, why don't you do a version for kids, or why don't you write a book for kids? You write so beautifully about trees. And eventually my publisher said the same thing. And when I went to have a look, my local bookstore, at what books were already out there to get a sense of, would there be room for my version of trees? And I found that there wasn't a kids' book exclusively on Australian trees. So that settled it, really. I thought, well, that there needs to be one, quick smart.
Do you have kids in your life at all, either your own kids or nieces and nephews or friends' kids at all? Or?
Friends' kids, yeah. I'm an only child, so, yeah, I don't get nieces and nephews, which is a shame. But I was a step-parent for a time, so and we read to those kids. That was a big part of the day, in the evening, settling them down and reading them kids' books, which was a great pleasure. So I discovered a whole lot of titles that, had come out since my own childhood. So it did give me a sense of what goes over well, when you read a book out loud, and what kids gravitate towards.
And did you use any of your friends' kids as guinea pigs on this to say, what do you think?
I haven't. The friends close by who have a very young child, he's a little young to gauge his response as yet, except to the pictures. But the process was such that I didn't see a finished copy of the book that I could sort of hand around and show people until it had been published. So I only really had the text and some online graphics of the pictures, the illustrations. So it wasn't. I didn't have a pilot copy.
Now, you mentioned in your talking about your background that you're a keen photographer. When you go through and started writing this book, did you have a batch of photos that you used to prompt you about what you were going to write about, or how did you decide to come up with the list of trees in this book?
Yeah, in some cases I did use some of my own photos as prompts, or kind of visual research. But a lot of the trees I know very well. So ironbarks I grew up with. They're kind of the signature tree of the Central West. So I knew them pretty well. And where I live now on the south coast, spotted gums and old man banksias, are right outside my window, and casuarinas too. So I probably didn't need to do that much. But yeah, some of the others back from Queensland days, the Antarctic beach and so on, I did go back to my photos of those, and remembering those walks that I've done on in the southeast of Queensland and the scenic rim and so on. So it was quite fun to relive the walks, actually. That's one of the reasons I like taking photos. You can drop yourself back into that story, that landscape pretty quickly.
Okay, that's good. Now, you're the author of the book, but there is actually an illustrator. Now, what's the relationship between author and illustrator? Do you write the text first, or do you get the images and then sort of put your text to that, or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, in this case, the text came first, and then we chose an illustrator, and she really just responded to my words. She came up with, and so Lisa Rogerson is the illustrator, and she's in WA, so in the COVID context, we have not even met yet. But she came up with an initial concept and sort of storyboarded the book, so sort of sketching out what illustrations would be with what text, with what tree species. And I had sort of suggested a mix of illustrations, so some focusing in on some of the detail of particular trees, and some trying to capture the whole tree. She went with that, and some of the trees she didn't know as well. So, being in WA, she hasn't seen a lot of old man banksias, so or Illawarra flame trees. So some of those, we sent through some additional photographs, not always mine either, but some pictures she could work off. But there wasn't a whole lot of back and forth. I saw a few completed illustrations early on and was really happy with those, and we were happy just to let her run with the rest of it. And then the final pictures came through, a little bit of tinkering, and there's a designer as well who comes in at the end within the publishing house and just lays it all out, and worked with Alicia on the end papers, which are really lovely. Yeah, sort of just finalising how the final format and how it would all look. So, yeah, not as collaborative as you might think, perhaps. I would have liked a bit more back and forth, but that was just the process for this one. But yeah, if we do more together, maybe there'll be a bit more of that back and forth, and hopefully meeting in person. I did just receive in the post yesterday. I purchased one of the original illustrations from Alicia, and it arrived in the post yesterday, and it's just stunning. The original paintings, which are acrylic on watercolor paper. I'm not sure of the reason for that, but they look beautiful. Yeah, so I can't wait to have it framed.
Well, that sort of brings me to my next comment here. I'm a part of the older generation, and I'm not quite as old as this question may say, but this book reminds me of books that we had in the house from May Gibbs, and the Big Bad Banksia Man and things like that. And the styling, whether it was deliberate or not, that's what it evoked that sort of memory in me. Was that deliberate, or just the way it ended up being?
Well, I'm a child of the 70s, so I think, perhaps I somehow in my own text sort of reverted to my childhood books, and May Gibbs was certainly prominent among those. And, yeah, so maybe that was just a natural style for me. And I'm not sure about Alicia. She's quite a bit younger than me, I think. But certainly in the cover design really captures that nostalgic feel, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, harks back to that period. So whether they picked that up from my text or that was just the designer's take on it, it was similar to your own response, just thinking May Gibbs and Australian children's books, of a couple of decades ago. Yeah, several decades ago.
I think the other thing with this book as well, you just look at the front cover of the book and it just says this is an Australian book, ignoring the fact that there's Australian plants on the front of it, but it just seems to say I'm Australian. There's no confusing that this is a book from the US or the UK at all. So I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, I wouldn't have necessarily picked that they would do that with the cover, but I quite like that they have. And it touches on that tradition of kids' books too, of, the big book of this and the great book of that. There's the book of Australian trees. I'm pretty sure there'll be more, but yeah, I guess it stands out. It's clear what it is, and certainly, yeah, it's been doing quite well, getting a lot of attention. So yeah, I think it was a good design choice for the cover. Perhaps, yeah, just the people who buy books are grandparents and parents, aren't they? So it's sort of ticking the boxes, the nostalgia box, or the childhood box for the people who will actually buy the book, I guess, too.
I hadn't actually thought of that.
Yeah.
Now, from your perspective, what makes a book that kids, and for that matter, adults, love to read?
I'm pretty keen on beautiful sentences. I think I can read about a book about anything if the sentences are beautiful, if it flows really easily, if it's easy to read, and yeah, just a touch of beauty about it. I think, whether it's a startling image or an idea you mightn't have thought of, bringing something to life in the imagination of the reader, that's really my job as I see it. Books for kids, I think what works well is for younger kids, some repetition, some rhyme, a lot of alliteration, which I use anyway in my description of nature. And I guess for slightly older kids, which I thought of too with this book, information that's interesting, the biggest tree, the fattest tree, the tallest tree, the oldest tree, those sort of key facts that kids, particularly boys, really like to have and to quote at the dinner table and so on. So that's why I chose some of the more charismatic species for this one. And I think kids too will be inclined to agree with me that, I still have that sense of wonder about the natural world, which children seem to have naturally, that to see trees as individuals, characters, to imagine them having personalities and lives of their own. So it was appealing to that, the sense of wonder and imagination that kids have.
That brings us on to our next question. In the book, in the introduction, you talk about, you're saying that trees are unique, a bit like people. And I must admit, I strongly agree with this statement. What's your connection to trees and nature? What's so special about nature for you?
Yeah, it's just where I feel at home, and attuned with, myself and the broader world, I guess. I grew up in a property, so sort of fairly pastoral landscape, but there was a wilder part that used to be, gold mining kind of area. So relatively hilly and rocky and pretty densely treed. And that's where I hung out as a kid and went camping from a pretty young age on my own, just roamed there. And I mean, it was real, of course, a real Australian landscape that I was home in, but it was also a place where my imagination flourished, where I could imagine little world, sort of fairy worlds or miniature worlds in the ferns and fungi and, whole stories around rocks and boulders and old gold mines and that sort of thing. So it was a place where reality and my imagination came together. These days, just to go walking in a forest, particularly among trees, is just, I think it might be that there's a lot more oxygen among trees so that I can breathe better, but it's also a place where I can breathe more metaphorically away from the sort of more man-made world of all the signs of civilization, the busyness of that. So it's a quiet place where I feel a bit more in tune with the planet. As I mentioned, I do love my photography, so images of the natural world, something I love sort of playing with. And just the physicality, I think, of moving over the landscape among trees, I just find quite meditative, I think. Yeah.
All right. Speaking of images, that brings us back to a question of, do you have a favourite image or tree in this book? And that I'm guessing that may be prompted. You mentioned you bought one of the original watercolours. Is that the same one, or is it?
It is. Yeah. I mean, I had first pick, but the initial illustration of the Antarctic beach, sort of just after the end papers, is the one I bought. And yeah, absolutely my favourite. It's sort of, you can see it really captures the age and complexity of the Antarctic beach and the sense that there's a whole world in every tree or every kind of grove of trees. A bit very much in tune with children's picture books, I think. You could imagine a bit like the Magic Faraway Tree or one of those classics in this beautiful Australian tree. And the Antarctic beach is pretty symbolic for me too, because they date back to Gondwanan times, and very recently in the bushfires, a lot of Gondwanan rainforest burned for the very first time. So there's an environmental message in the book too. It's difficult to write about trees without being concerned for their future and for the habitats that for so many other species that they provide. But I found that very hard to take, that rainforest trees, of course, can't recover from fire. They can't just come back. So knowing that there are trees around, and like the Antarctic beach, that perhaps even have genetic material dating back to that time, because they kind of coppice themselves, sort of regrow from the same root material. The idea that a tree has been around that long and then, we might lose those trees on our watch, I find, very upsetting, I guess. And it's a good note of warning that we need to do more to manage climate change and to protect these precious trees.
Okay. Now, one final question. This book is obviously aimed at children, but who really should read this book?
Everyone. One of my friends at the local market asked me, well, who's it for? What age group? And I said, well, 3 to infinity. So, yeah, I'm very much hoping that parents will enjoy it too, and that it'll prompt some conversations between children and their parents, or children and their grandparents, or aunties or uncles, or whatever adults in their lives. And I guess anyone interested in Australian trees, there's probably information there that a lot of adults don't know, or have forgotten, and some fun references too. I mean, Jimmy Barnes gets a reference, so there's some of that cultural interplay between our native trees and the way that's fed into our literature and our music and our everyday lives.
Okay, so we've been talking with Inga Simpson on her latest book, The Book of Australian Trees. Inga, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Tim. Thank you so much.
That was a really interesting interview with Inga Simpson about her book, The Book of Australian Trees. I just loved the way in which she talked about the trees, and when you read the book, it's quite factual, but it's told in a very accessible and interesting way. So there's a bit of a story and a bit of a narrative, and she did mention that when she was talking about the reference to Jimmy Barnes and how it was. There's a little bit of nostalgia in there about books of old. So Tim, you were talking about the May Gibbs books, and it definitely has that look and feel and kind of narrative about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I looked at this book, and just from the front cover, I'm not as old as it may seem.
Oh, you are.
The May Gibbs books that we had in our house from my older siblings and even from my parents' days, they were just beautiful books. And just looking at the front cover of this book, and Jill mentioned to me before we did this segment of the podcast, it just had that tactile sort of feel. It just had this look of, this is an old Australian type of book. And as I mentioned during the interview as well, it just felt like it was an Australian book. It wasn't just a book from the US or Canada or the UK. It just said this is Australian.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the other thing I said was that while it's a book for children and children of all ages, it's actually quite a nice coffee table sort of book, and I think lots of adults would get a lot of value out of thumbing through the pages and reading some of the text and taking in the images.
I think certainly, in that coffee table type of book, it does focus on the iconic trees. You've got the old man Banksia, you've got the ironbark, you've got the river red gum. So, if you can think of an iconic tree from your area, the Moreton Bay fig, there's a batch of trees there that most people would know many of the trees, and certainly the ones in their more common area that tend to be dominant.
Yeah, and the illustrations are quite beautiful, and the one that I like most is the red ironbark, Eucalyptus fibrosa, and it's the image is just you can almost feel the sort of roughness and the texture of the bark in that image.
I mean, certainly from my perspective, there are a lot of really nice images in there. I mean, my two favourites were probably the ironbark, which I've always loved that tree. I've loved the flowers. I love the dark, very hard-looking bark on it. But I also liked the Antarctic beech, which Inga mentioned as being her favourite tree as well.
Yeah, it's quite beautiful, and she was probably quite lucky to get that image from the artist.
So, I mean, as Inga said, really this is a children's book, but as Jill mentioned, it's a coffee table book. It'd be a good book to give people from overseas as a present to sort of give them an indication of what Australian trees are like. Yeah, it's not a botanical, in-depth sort of book. Although Inga does do some more adult versions of these books. This was her first children's book. And I think she's done a really good job of it.
Yeah, and having said that, I mean, given our background in plants, I mean, there'd be a lot of people who don't have the basics around some of these trees. So, while it's not a detailed botanical scientific based book, it has all of that, information in it that is accurate, that is factual, told in a really accessible way. So, it's a very easy read, and you do take away quite interesting snippets about each of the trees. And I'm sure if you read it many times, then, they would stay with you. The thing that I liked when she was talking was the way in which she wrote the book was about getting children to be, talking over the dinner table with mum and dad or uncles and aunts or grandparents, and just for them to, pull out one or two interesting features about the book that starts a conversation.
I think she was talking specifically about boys there.
She was, but I guess girls do the same thing too. But yeah, boys, yeah, yeah. Thanks.
I think the thing from my perspective as well is I think about the photos I take, and certainly for when we do our hikes, I try and give a good indication of what the hike is like. But if I have to go through the thousands of photos I've taken over the years, the bulk of them have to do with trees and plants, more so than, say, animals or the landscape in general. And even the landscape in general, you're taking trees as forming part of that.
And more specifically, bark.
Yeah.
We love bark. I don't know why.
So, Inga did mention that she's into photography, and she goes through when she goes walking and hiking, she take a lot of photos, and that's just something I tend to do for my own personal preference rather than, for the blog itself.
And I think the other thing that stuck out for me, one of the themes of the book is that, trees are like people. So when you look at them at a macro level, they all appear to be the same. You start to focus in and you see all these really different, interesting features, even within the one stand of the same species. So, it does encourage you to look a little bit closer.
All right. So as part of this podcast episode, we've also gone through and done a review of the book, and the link to that will be in the show notes. So I've got a few basic photos in the show notes itself. But if you go to the written version or the write-up of the book review, we'll show you some of the images and the text as well, just to give you an indication of what it's like. I know as I go through and prepare this podcast and put it to air, the first print run of this book is selling very fast, and in fact you may actually struggle to find it, and I certainly have done in some instances as I'm doing this podcast, but there is a second print run coming out fairly shortly, so even if you can't get hold of a copy of it straight away, you might find them in your local store, but certainly there's more coming, so don't worry, that it certainly will be available, and it'd be a good Christmas present heading up towards the end of the year.
Seeing it's June, we're planning for Christmas now.
Yeah. It's time to start Christmas shopping. Okay. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and the interview with Inga. Again, I really do enjoy doing these sort of interviews that, while they're peripherally related to hiking, really we're walking through nature and we're seeing this sort of stuff, so it is very much squarely related to what we do. Okay, that's all for this week's episode. Bye for now.
And bye from me.